Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And one thing I've struggled with on this series in particular is the question of mystique, especially as it's the sort of thing that's tough to contextualize outside of the explicit moment in which it's felt. And it's a feeling that has persisted with certain acts for far longer than you would ever expect. And you can argue there are acts who came and went so quickly with projects that seem so transcendent that the legacy sticks around for years or even decades. Hell, J Electronica has kept hype alive on the potential of a debut album for over a decade now. But you know what? If you're removed from that time, if you didn't live it, if you weren't there, well, it's a little bit complicated to assess because you're trying to contextualize a moment and capture its significance, but also be realistic on how the art's impact has persisted, how much of that luster really remains if you haven't lived it. And I can't think of many living rappers who have captured that sort of mystique to hold it for so long as Yasin Bey, who 20 years ago was known as Mos Def. Now, we've already talked about Mos Def in this series in particular, thanks to his landmark breakthrough with Talib Kweli on Black Star, but in the process, both artists were building towards solo debuts on their own on Ruckus. Talib's dropping in 2000 under his duo name Reflection Eternal with producer High Tech to a lot of critical acclaim. Hopefully I'll get a chance to cover it here. But Mos Def had gotten ahead the year earlier, winning the sort of critical acclaim that would allow weaker projects of his, like The New Danger and True Magic, to skate by before The Ecstatic would drop in 2009 to win back a lot of fans and critics. But that was also the last commercially released album we would get under the name Mos Def. But you can trace a lot of his mystique back to that debut album, how it left such a mark, widely hailed as one of the best hip-hop albums of the late 90s to ever be released. So yeah, let's not waste any more time. This is Black on Both Sides by Mos Def, and this is Resonators. So there's a big reason I started this conversation about Black on Both Sides talking about mystique, because right from the first half dozen listens I gave this album, the more I immediately understood why it was critically beloved at the time and cemented Mos Def's influence in the scene. A sprawling project that showed Mos Def not just establishing his skills as a conscious lyricist that could cross over, but also unwilling to step into genres outside of hip-hop at that time, from R&B to even hardcore punk. And yeah, I wouldn't deny that it's a really damn great album where I can hear a lot of the influences to this day, but it's also one where outside of that very specific moment in 1999, the mystique just does not quite have the same luster for me. And I'd argue that nearly 20 years later, Black on Both Sides doesn't quite have that same gripping resonance, and flaws noticed even then tend to seem a bit more evident today. It's still great, but there are questions. And since I might as well dive straight into this heresy, let's talk about some of those flaws right on the back, the first being this album's length. And you know what, for once, I can see the justification that Black on Both Sides is indeed varied enough that it can make use of that hour-plus runtime. It certainly never feels like it's boring or it's a one-dimensional listen. Now, the word I'm more inclined to use for it is sprawling, and not particularly concerned with momentum or a lot of flow from song to song, as Mos Def will slip from b-boy lyricism to more storytelling and painting more of a descriptive picture, to the more politically charged songs, then with a pace that makes you expect that there's a greater level of insight in between the lines, and where my first real problems start to slide into focus. Now, again, part of this is a question of the times, and something I've grappled with throughout Resonators, as I brought up. The projects that lay a lot of the foundation, but don't quite transcend it years later. And it's hard not to feel like chunks of Black on Both Sides lay out a lot of ideas that might have seemed revelatory at the time, but don't quite have the same impact nowadays, at least not in the bars themselves. Like take the album's centerpiece, Rock and Roll, which highlights the lengthy Black legacy in shaping the genre, where their names are often written out of history or just forgotten, where Mos Def actually drops names of acts like Limp Bizkit and Korn that continue that tradition of pushing hip-hop elements into new metal and co-opting them. But I'd argue the more potent statement is how the song then devolves into a killer and rather convincing convincing Bad Brains-esque hardcore punk breakdown, rather than what feels like now an observation that doesn't really progress further and that we've heard a lot. Of course, the counterpoint to that is how the black influence in a lot of musical genres is often overlooked even to this day, and yeah, that's true for the record. But my problem with the album is more linked to how Mos Def's observations are populist enough to grab a lot of attention, they feel accessible, but don't take that added step to cut into the system beneath it. Oh, he notes the impact. Mr. N-Word is a great and still relevant example highlighting a lot of systemic racism, as are the more class-conscious GOT and Mathematics and the creepingly prophetic New World Water, but they just feel like a half step away from being truly revolutionary, with the pivot towards more peace and love as kind of the answer that kind of undercuts it. Prime example, for as much as I really like the low-key melody and flow of Umi Says, one of the many examples of Mos Def singing across this album in a way that I did not expect to like as much as I did, and good evidence of some of that genre bending, but when he licensed the song to Nike in 2001, he changed lines on the bridge from wanting black people to be free to wanting all people to be free, which, yes, popularized the song, but also sucked away some of that impact, at least for me. And while most people won't really notice or care about such little changes, especially given the success he later found, it does kind of change how I viewed parts of Black on Both Sides, especially when it circles around Mos Def himself. Now again, really great rapper, his technical wordplay is solid as hell, he's got a lot of real charisma as an MC, he's expressive, and can easily hold his own opposite Busta Rhymes and Talib Kweli on songs here, and Q-Tip, and I'd argue he's even a decent enough singer to handle some of his own hooks around the plentiful samples. But there is something oddly oblique about Mos Def that continues to this day, and how we don't really see much of a personal story to ground or lend intensity to a lot of these songs. He paints his borough of Brooklyn with a lot of vibrant colors, and he can set the scene remarkably well to set forward his worldview and ideas, but it's also hard not to observe a little cagey distance in how we don't really get many personal or revealing details about him to humanize a lot of these stories. Hell, most of it comes through on Mr. N-Word, where he relates the awkward profiling of a flight attendant who will later beg for his autograph, and on Miss Fat Booty, which outside of including a slur, ends on the punchline of, oh, she's not interested because she's bi or lesbian, and then the framing kind of muddies how funny we're supposed to consider it. Now, on the flip side, how his own world and surrounding colors him, it is plainly evident, especially on the final third and most conscious and best section of the album, and his canny self-awareness of how hip-hop and the music industry isn't always the saving element it's painted to be in society. It's a really solid highlight on hip-hop, and know that. And I'm always a sucker for the sort of interplay on Do It Now with Busta Rhymes, even though I'm not entirely crazy with the oddly crunchy glitch making up a lot of the melody and the production. But I don't know, I still feel a little bit of distance that I don't want. But while I'm here, if I want to highlight one of the greatest saving graces of the album that pushes it back towards greatness, it does come in the production and groove. The sonic palette might not quite feel as warm and burnished as it was on Black Star, but Mos Def pulled a lot of organic melodies and some great samples and groove behind them, rich with vintage New York boom bap flavor, but also with a live bass line that adds a ton of real organic foundation. The richer horns backing hip-hop, that striking Aretha Franklin sample for the hook of Miss Fat Booty, the rattling but eerie cascades behind New World Water, the punchy scratches and the swagger on Know That, the flip across 3 different and distinctive samples that feels remarkably cohesive on Brooklyn, along with a rather amusing Red Hot Chili Peppers interpolation, the roiling funk of Mr. N-Word, and of course how DJ Premier delivered off the sharper guitar line on Mathematics with that scratching. But there's also a smoothness and flair for stepping into slightly weirder sounds that Mos Def is just as credible with. The dusty, almost jazzy stutter of the Sandy drums across Love and Speed Law, the crunching squonk of the keyboards on Got that keeps up that same gurgle across Habitat, another song I really liked, and especially that bassy groove across the twinkling chimes on Umi Says, it highlights the album's accessibility and uncanny knack for some really good hooks, even if there are places where you wish the tempo was a little bit quicker or you brought a little bit more anthemic prowess. In fact, I'd argue the one place where the experimentation doesn't quite stick the landing is Climb, where the oily vocal layering around the organ and the twinkling quasi-futuristic blur just feels like an odd interlude where the groove and blending never quite comes together. But again, that's what you get when you got an experiment that doesn't quite stick the landing. And I'll say this, Black on Both Sides is gonna give Mos Def plenty of time to experiment, even if it does feel like a really sprawling and at the end kind of lengthy listen. But as a whole, You know what, it's the sort of project where I completely understand why it was so influential in its time, and if its luster has faded a bit for me, that's more because it feels like a great solo debut that's got the indulgence of such a debut album and feels characteristic of that time. It's smart and well constructed, but could afford to dive a little deeper. Experimental, but a little flabby in patches. You kinda expect that with underground hip-hop of that era. Now, unlike most of the albums I've covered in this year's Resonators, I could definitely see how Mos Def could push a project like this for accessibility and even mainstream crossover, which no doubt reinforces his reputation and mystique just because more people have heard it. And you know what? Even if I don't love this in the same way I love Black Star, what Mos Def brought on this project is absolutely worth a lot of re-listens, which is why I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 and absolutely a recommendation. Mos Def might not have given us a wealth of material to really decode throughout the past 20 years, but you know what? On this alone, his legacy is secure, and for me, worth checking out. For sure. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I understand this might be heresy that I don't quite love this album as much as other episodes of Resonators, but yeah, it's great. It just didn't quite connect as emotionally as I was really hoping. But if you want to buy or stream the album, link's down there below, and I got the poll up there. I am curious where more people fall on this going back to it 20 years later. I know a lot of people love it, and we'll see where they go. Beyond that, anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Or if you're looking for new episodes of Billboard Breakdown or other episodes of Resonators, links are on the card right over there. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.